dimineața tuturor!
Good morning, everybody.
Deschidem astăzi
We are
ziua a
opening
doua
to the second day
Summitului Asociației
of the
Administratorilor de
Summit
Fonduri,
of the
ediția
Association of
numărul
Fund
3.
Managers, the third
Este,
edition.
așa cum spuneam și ieri,
As
o
I was
ediție
saying
online.
yesterday, this is an
Este a
online
doua ediție
edition,
online,
the
doar
second
prima
online
ediție
edition.
am reușit să o
We've
realizăm în format
managed
fizic și
to
sperăm să
have
ne întoarcem cât de curând
a
la
face-to-face meeting only for the
formatul fizic
first
în
one.
care, prin intermediul căruia să
And let's hope
dialogăm
we
și mai
shall
bine. Summitul, așa
go
cum
back to
spuneam
our
și
face-to-face
ieri,
meetings as soon as possible. As I was saying
este o
yesterday,
dezbatere, se dorește a fi
this
o
is a
dezbatere de
debate
idei, de tendințe
around ideas and trends.
și voi, înainte de a vorbi despre ziua de
And
astăzi, o
before
să
talking
trag
about
câteva concluzii
today,
despre ceea ce s-a
I would
discutat
like to draw some conclusions about what we have discussed yesterday. And some remarks of the speakers drew my attention. That is, the industry, a year since the summit, has over 50 billion lei in management. Yesterday, you also said that bank loans have the greatest percentage within fund management, and the bank industry is one of the biggest promoters of investment funds. The financial education is also very important, and it should be done in elementary school. We also talked about the fact that there is a too greater degree of bank savings, and the industry must make this capital flow. And the role of the funds is to make money flow for those who have real savings. We've also talked about inflation, and we reached the conclusion that a weapon against inflation is to perform investments in funds on long term using discipline and perseverance. We've also talked about personal investment plans, which comprise a few important elements that each of us may take into consideration. That is, how much each of us gains, how much savings we have. So these were the main ideas of yesterday. So for today, we shall have two panels, very interesting panels. The first one shall be moderated by Adina Ardeleanu, and I want to thank her. Comes from Financial Intelligence. We shall talk about the perspectives in the asset management industry, and during the second panel shall be moderated by Stelian Mușcalu from DG24, and we shall talk about topics such as alternative investments and private equity funds. We shall have an international participant from Amundi Asset Management and from Franklin Templeton. And Will Goodhart shall join us during the first panel. He is the CEO of CFA Society in the United Kingdom. Before passing the floor to Adina, I would like to thank the sponsors, Raiffeisen's Management, BRD Asset Management, NN Investment Partners, OTP Asset Management, Amundi Asset Management, Franklin Templeton, Banat Crișana, Evaget, SIF Transilvania, SIF Muntenia, and SIF Oltenia. I hope you will enjoy today's meeting, and I hope you will hear interesting things today, things that will be debated by my colleague, then that will be conveyed to you. So, Adina, you have the floor. Good luck to you all. Thank you, Horia. Welcome everybody at the Summit of asset administrators fund, and I'm really happy that this association has invited me for the third year in a row. Yesterday's discussions have been really interesting and useful. What I know is that the investment industry is the ace on the sleeve. So I would like to start today's discussions from this point. Before that, I would like to tell you that I saw that all panels are moderated by journalists, and journalists support the funds industry and help people through informing them. We collect your information and we try to convey them to the public. I saw that in Romania, investment funds have become more known. We have over 500,000 fund investors with assets of over 50 billion lei. But the opportunity, the potential is much higher. So let's see the development and let's see the investment funds reaching the public. Today's panel is about the perspectives in the asset management industry at global level and in Romania. And I shall discuss with Mr. Will Goodhart, COO from CFA Society, with Milan Prușan from Investment Partners Romanian, Cristian Pascu, and Deputy Management BCR, and Bertrand Pujol, Global Head of Business Development for Immunity Solutions. Good morning, Mr. Goodhart. We decided to have a small presentation for each speaker, a small introduction of each speaker, and then we shall move on to the debates and we shall ask questions. So, Mr. Goodhart, what are the regulations at the European and UK level with respect to the asset management industry?
Well, Adina, thank you so much, and thank you to the association for the kind invitation to join you today. I think that the body of regulation and policy that is most affecting the funds industry in the United Kingdom is probably in relation to sustainable investment. And I have a short presentation that I will try and share with you. Let me just check that you can see that. Are you able to see that, Adina? Could you nod your head? Wonderful. Thank you so much. So this is just a chart that shows us what I think we already know, which is that the world of sustainable investing is growing very rapidly indeed. We now have around 35% of the assets under management in Europe are now invested sustainably, which is really an extraordinary growth rate. If you think about the extent to which the proportion has grown, which means that so much of the new flow into the fund sector is coming through sustainable investment. But what we've seen in response to that is, let me just move on one slide. Apologies. Is a backlash now in terms of concerns that are the investments that people are offering sustainable, and is investing sustainably a sensible development. And in terms of regulation, again, we've seen in the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, SFDR, the European Union seek to impose standards on sustainable investments so that those people who are buying sustainable investments can be confident in the degree of sustainability that the investments offer. But I'm not sure that that is necessarily dealing entirely with the challenge. And our view at CFA is that what we need is greater development of skills, which I suppose you would expect us to say as a professional body helping to educate investment professionals, but also standards, so that there is a common understanding of what investing sustainably means. The criticisms so far are really that ESG investing doesn't make very much change. It distracts from the necessary policy action that's really needed to address the climate crisis, and perhaps that it doesn't affect the cost of capital for either issuers who have a poor sustainability profile or have an attractive or lower cost of capital for those companies that have a good sustainability profile. There also, I think, is just a misunderstanding about what ESG investing is, and that's partly because ESG investing is so many different things. There's really a spectrum of capital in ESG investing, and I'll just put this up on the screen. I don't know if this is something that is already known to the attendees this morning. This is a slide from the Impact Investing Institute in the UK, which is a body that I also sit on. And what it shows is on the far left-hand side, we have the traditional investment practices. So it's sort of pre-sustainability. And now what we've moved into is responsible investment, which is where you're seeking really to avoid harm. And then sustainable investment, where you're seeking to actually contribute, but not necessarily directly, but be supportive of the achievement of things like the Sustainable Development Goals. And increasingly, we're seeing people move towards impact investing, where the fund is designed to deliver a financial return, but also to contribute a positive impact either on environmental factors or on social factors. So my concerns around greenwashing are that the critics of sustainable investing believe that everything that is called ESG is trying to be impactful, when that is not the case. I think it is entirely valid for investment firms to launch ESG funds whose purpose really is exclusively to protect and improve the return to the portfolio, and not necessarily to do any good beyond that in the real economy. That makes an enormous amount of sense. ESG factors are clearly risk factors to a portfolio and ought to be taken into consideration, but there isn't necessarily then a requirement for that fund manager to be concerned about climate and sustainability. We believe that fund managers should be, but if the client is actually solely concerned about the financial return, it makes sense to take ESG factors into account rather than necessarily to then invest very heavily in stewardship to try to address the behavior of investee companies. But there is very clearly a backlash against sustainable investing, which you would expect following the very strong growth in sustainable investing. And there are quite a number of people who have not benefited from that and who are seeking, I think, to throw a little sand in the wheels. So our concern, as I say, is to educate people, to call for high professional standards, and to encourage the debate around these issues, to allow us to really think through some of these challenges. And in terms of education, we've done a couple of things. We've launched a certificate in ESG investing, which is designed really to give people who are new to ESG a good background, a good basis for building on their experience. It is written entirely by people who are already practitioners in the marketplace. We talk obviously through the different factors, environment, social, and governance. Then we get really into the meat of this, which is sort of how do you incorporate ESG into valuation processes and also portfolio construction, and then a little bit on portfolio reporting. Now, we launched this in 2019, and pretty much as soon as we did, people started saying, well, there's not enough in it on climate, and climate is becoming more important. And clearly we've seen that at a policy level, certainly in the UK, increasingly, well, very definitely in the EU, and also now within the US. There are very significant policy moves to change the way that economies work, so that they are powered by clean energy, and to encourage the development of the decarbonization of other key sectors of the economy as we seek to deliver net zero in 2050. So we have developed a new certificate in climate and investing, which provides, like the ESG certificate, a really strong background in the knowledge that's required by investment professionals, information about the regulatory background, which is clearly changing very quickly, and then more information about how to incorporate climate into investing in listed investment instruments and also into private markets, because a lot of activity in this field is in the private market space. And just to sort of to wrap up my comments, we're also concerned, I won't spend time on this because I know we want to move on to the debate, but in terms of standards, because standards, to come back to my opening remarks about the very strong growth in the market, the EU seeking to regulate the market so that investors continue to have faith in the market and understand how the market is operating for sustainable investment. But we believe that there is a need for improved disclosure standards, which explain the many different types of sustainable investing so that each individual client knows what they're investing in. Are they investing in a thematic fund? Are they investing in an impact fund? Are they investing in an ESG fund that has is really designed to only benefit the portfolio, not to benefit people and planet, and so on. So there are lots of different types. At CFA Institute, we're working hard to figure out how we can help people understand that. And we're also working with regulators and policymakers around the world to ensure that the standards that emerge are relatively common and uniform, because nobody wants to have 38 different sets of standards to work with. It's extremely expensive for different organizations to incorporate those, and harder for investors then to understand that. But with that, I will close my comments and thank you again for the opportunity to participate. And I look forward to hearing the comments from the other speakers.
Mulțumesc, Will Goodhart. Iată că noi ne-am referit la educația financiară pentru public, pentru investitori sau viitori investitori, dar și profesioniști din
But also for professionals in the domain, they also need the continuous education and certification with respect to the new trends. Moving on to green economy, so this economy is practically here. We must embrace it. The investors require sustainable products, supporting the environment, corporate governance. So Milan Prușan, I would like to ask you, because we want to move on, what is your opinion on ESG investment, and if Romania is prepared to embrace this trend? Good morning, everybody, and thank you for your invitation. It's been an honor to take part in this summit together with the colleagues in the panel, who are really relevant in the industry, with a high expertise at the global level. So I wanted to talk about the sustainable investment area, since this panel is about the development of the global asset management industry and about medium and long-term investments. ESG shall have a main role in these developments, and we shall see many debates on this topic. And I think the greatest challenge will be to convey the message to the end investors, to the retail market, who shall integrate these trends in individuals' portfolios in order to obtain higher yields. So I shall present the topic of sustainable investors from the perspective of an European manager who wants to influence the area of sustainable investments, since these investments are integrated in 70% of our assets. Over 35 billion euro represent sustainable assets which incorporated the three sustainability criteria, ESG, and 7 billion euro assets in impact funds or thematic funds. And I shall present each of these categories. So it is a presentation for most of the funds administrators in funds, a classification of these funds actually. As Will said before, we are talking about a general topic which must be completely understood, irrespective of the type of the investor, so in order to maximize their potential. So I have chosen three categories. I have classified these in three categories, the most important being the area of impact investment. These are investments with a concrete objective to have a positive influence on the society and the environment without forgetting about corporate governance criteria. But the main objective is to have a positive impact both from a social and environmental perspective, but both from the perspective of the yield, the second of the return on investment. The second category comprises the environment, social, and corporate governance. That is, we must perform profitable portfolios, and we have a good management of the fund. The third category, sustainable investment, is mainly focused on the fight against climate change, which are harmful to the environment. And it is managed using well-monitored corporate governance. So the social factor is somehow left behind, not entirely, but we are focusing on the fight against climate change.
Jucători din industrie, reglementările Organizației Națiunilor Unite și cele 17 standarde de dezvoltare durabilă stabilite în 2015 au dat startul unei noi revoluții.
In 2015, we saw the start of a new revolution in the field of asset management, and they are targeted at three major topics: the human area, the planet, and financial prosperity, or the democratization of the financial market, including in areas that are less advantaged right now. All of these targets involve some exclusions because the sustainability risk involves a number of decisions that could influence the investment decisions, but in the long run they will bring some major benefits. Well, these are the most obvious areas of exclusion in the area of the sustainable strategies. Now we move on to asset managers. Well, this is associated to the lawmaking and to the regulatory area and to the schedule of the European Union. This is a pretty clear calendar based on which alignment to the new sustainability criteria should be provided. This is information that should reach the markets. The integration of the ESG factors in the investment strategies and the classification of financial costs, including in what concerns this regulation that governs the transparency. The reporting area is equally important in what concerns the issuers and the financial markets, because clients should be exposed to products that they understand and that add value, including in what concerns performance. Well, as a conclusion, the closest and the newest regulation that governs sustainability factors is the SFDR, and this involves a transparency of the way in which participants in the financial market understand and integrate sustainability and bring their investment strategies in line with these new parameters. Basically, there are three categories of sustainability factors. First of all, it's the traditional products that integrate or not one of the three um, sustainability criteria. Then we move on to Article 8. These are products with ESG characteristics. These are financial products that incorporate all of the three ESG criteria. And the most powerful one, the so-called dark green, is Article 9 that integrates financial products that have a tangible impact, a quantifiable impact, and an impact that can be demonstrated when it comes to investment and financial and sustainable investments. Well, these topics will gain even more traction in our country. We see something in Romania which is quite commendable, and we expect to see a development and a footprint ever more developed throughout Romania and in all investors in Romania. Well, that much from me. Thank you so much. We will surely be getting back to the ESG in the following minutes. Well, each speaker shall have one brief presentation. I'm inviting now Mr. Pascu from BCR. He will be talking about the legal changes, because these are very important as well. You have the floor. Thank you, Adina. Well, yes, indeed, the legislative part of things, it's a little bit boring, but it's the so-called necessary evil, because if we don't have laws and norms, that we cannot operate. So I will be introducing to you some legal changes. I'm trying to turn it into a catchy sort of thing. And I will be talking about two things. First of all, it's the update of the regulations that we already have and have been successfully implemented so far. And secondly, I will be talking about something that we need, new laws that we need, or new legal amendments that we need in order to develop this particular industry. Well, I think I should be sharing my screen with you. I hope this works. Well, thank you. Well, as I was saying, for the first part, I will be focusing on a so-called, domestic approach. And it's about extant regulations that we have. So when it comes to existing regulations, we have domestic regulations and external regulations and other ancillary regulations that have an impact on asset management. When it comes to local regulations, to domestic regulations, I like to mention here regulation, which is pretty new. It's regulation number 11 per 2021 that amends and completes the regulation number 10 of the Financial Supervisory Authority. Well, this initiative is quite welcome because we do need to regulate the alternative investments. And based on these regulations, they are trying to lever private equity to create like a new market. And I would also like to tell you that this new regulatory framework focuses on enhancing the flexibility of the legal framework and also on harmonizing the legal framework in order to incentivize and stimulate the registration of these new sort of entities into Romania so that the market can continue to grow. The main amendments focus on risk capital funds and private equity funds. And this amendment is actually about the opportunity to register asset managers as limited liability companies. It's also about reducing the red tape, the bureaucracy, and which involves less documents that should be submitted to the Financial Supervisory Authority. Also, everybody knows about the documents that have to be submitted, the procedure that is quite cumbersome if you want to be an asset management or a fund manager, or if you want to have a new fund registered. So now the workload is pretty low. You don't need that many procedures. Why? Because you don't have like the need to have like a compliance officer or a risk manager. You don't need to have those no more. On the market, there is these jobs are in great demand, you know, and the authority, the Financial Supervisory Authority, is trying to support these funds by doing away with the need to have these jobs, these positions. And since we are now digitizing documents, well, you need to know that all documents may be submitted electronically. Basically, you don't need to have stamps or signatures or registration in the document registration office of these authorities, and the documents to be sent by fund managers shall have to be sent every year. Why? In order to encourage the private equity funds and the venture capital funds to act more and to be more active. Well, now I believe that these legal changes will ultimately enable other entities to register themselves with the FSA, Financial Supervisory Authority. The second regulation that I will mention is Regulation 20 per 2020 that amends and completes Regulation number 9. This regulation actually came out last fall, and I would like to salute here the fact that the FSA is so open to amending the legislation. Well, actually, there are two major things to talk about right here. The first amendment is that the joint stock companies that are admitted on regulated markets, or they are admitted on alternative trading systems, and that the manager can, if he or she considers that the price is not relevant for certain methods, well, he can decide that those shares can be assessed based on some evaluation report. I think that this is very beneficial to the market, because we all know that market, especially aero market, there are many companies that had a certain price a couple of years ago, and this price may no longer be relevant, or the transactions are not that numerous. Maybe you have 2 or 3 transactions every 3 months, and their prices are in no way connected to reality. So, you know, you need to work on prices that are not that beneficial. And basically, you have an option as an administrator to decide to use an evaluation report based on which to set prices that are more attractive. And another issue, which is quite interesting, it's about collective placements in real estate businesses. More specifically, these instruments may be assessed based on methods involving the fair value. More specifically, there are mathematical models based on which to set the prices. And these can be used for those who have like a more cautious approach. So basically, you can still evaluate a price set by an evaluator based on some models, and this is considered to be like the market price. In this way, you can consider that your entire portfolio is evaluated based on some quotations. Well, this is very good, especially for the pandemic period, because during the pandemic period, we found that at a time of crisis, it's good to find the right method, because sometimes it's very difficult to leave like a collective placement deal. And you know, you need to have a quotation which is provided by a counterparty in order to make the most of your portfolio. Well, these are the two things that I would like to specify in terms of domestic regulations. I would like to cover the external regulations now. Well, when it comes to these external regulations, I'd like to tell you something that has actually been covered by some of my co-panelists who talked about the ESG. I would like to tell you that this regulation has been, of course, been implemented in Romania. It's been around since March. A lot of colleagues have modified their prospects in order to reflect these legal changes. Some of our colleagues have obtained approvals. Other people's approvals are pending right now. But, you know, this is a major step forwards when it comes to sustainable investment. It also has a component involving social protection, environment protection, and also, of course, government issues. So it's the ESG. I would like to talk to you about the cross-border distribution of the investment funds. I believe that at least as Europe is concerned, well, I'd say that for the foreign funds, we have like a proper framework enabling cross-border transactions. Why? Because up until these regulations came out, each authority had been able to set its own rules based on which to enable this cross-border distribution. But once these EU regulations came out, basically these are two EU regulations that are directly applicable in Romania. So once these regulations came out, you were no longer supposed to transpose them in the domestic legislation, so they are directly enforceable. So we are EU, so we have to enforce these regulations that come out from Brussels. Well, these two regulations are actually aimed at doing away with those barriers hindering cross-border distribution. We are also talking about alternative funds here, and they provide a high level of protection and lower costs. Well, I can do with a lower cost because, you know, previously people from abroad were able to sell their products in Romania, and the former provisions would rather favor the big ones, and they would not favor that much the small ones. So, you know, we need some fair ground for everybody. So I guess that new investment will be coming into Romania. Now we have like a consistent framework for all of these investments. Some criteria, some conditions are there now. They have to be complied with, some consistent standards all across the trading areas. So now we have standardization, of course, including the language, because, you know, back in the day, you needed like translations, which was quite cumbersome. So now the documentation is in English, so you no longer have to have it translated into Romanian and so on. Also published are all of the management fees. They are transparent, they are public. And what about the novelties? What about the novelties of these regulations coming from EU is the pre-marketing concept. This is quite interesting because it basically enables you to sort of testing, you know, the investments target. So basically you do the pre-marketing, you can test it. And well, this pre-marketing is now being standardized, which is good. And I guess that we should also mention that although some rules are only devoted to the big ones, throughout Europe, 70% of the assets were held by investment funds only selling on their own domestic markets. Only 37% of the collective placement bodies were registered to run sales in several countries. Then I would like to talk about the ancillary regulations that have an impact. And I would like to talk very briefly about the CSDR regulation. Everybody knows about that. Market participants have been putting a lot of pressure to postpone the implementation date because there are some problems. Basically, they were talking about February, but now it's February 2022. The main target was, you know, about standardization and about increasing the number of transactions that were, you know, disbursed on time. Also imposed were some discipline. I mean, if participants are not complying with the rules and standards, penalties were enforced, and also some oversight requirements, prudential oversight requirements also came out. So they had the biggest impact on these so-called custodians because, you know, they need to change their own systems, they need to be changing their procedures, but it also has an impact on fund managers and on their customers. Of course, there has to be some change in the activity flows that will ultimately have an impact on the clients. Well, to give you some flavor of the local markets, the central depository is an advanced progress with the implementation process. So now we are waiting for the state-owned depositories to come up with some information. Technical details are being awaited. Information is also being awaited for the funds, for the market. The commissions and other fees are also expected. Some changes will happen when it comes, you know, to the T-bills, to the government bonds, actually. And I would also like to cover here the SRD, Shareholder Rights Directive, that has been around for about 4 years and has been transposed in Romania as per law number 158. And it's about the involvement of shareholders in the business of companies. I've seen in Europe that shareholders are now participating more through the custodians. They are voting. It's actually an obligation of the local administrators to participate in the life of companies, to cast votes, and also to keep an eye on how companies comply with sustainable investment. Each administrator should publish their own report about how they involve themselves in the life of the companies in which they are putting their money. These are all changes that have an impact, and of course these changes will bring about a better discipline on the market and also a better standardization. Well, that much from me. Thank you so much.
I shall take over. I shall present some trends from your presentation: digitalization, removal of borders. Just to sum up the presentation, unfortunately, our next guest will not be able to join our discussions, but starting from these trends set up by you during discussions, we shall talk about the perspectives of the asset management industry. But before that, the pandemics kind of stopped our activities, and I think this was felt within the asset management industry, and I would like to ask you, how did you feel? What was your opinion about this period? So, Will Goodhart, how did you feel this change in the education area? What were the courses in more demand? Did the courses were the courses performed in online environments? So, what is your opinion?
Thank you. That's a really good question. We did experience quite an increase in demand, I imagine, because people had saved time instead of commuting and were very conscious of the way that the world is changing and wanted to advance their skills and their careers. And so did spend some time in registering and studying for the courses that we offer, which now are available online. The CFA program can still be studied online, but you need actually to attend a test center to be able to take it. So it was difficult for some people to take the CFA program during COVID, but the ESG certificate can be taken entirely online, and the climate certificate will be taken in the same way in future. I think the COVID crisis, in some ways, strangely, was quite good for the investment management sector in the UK. The investment management sector in the UK had an outstanding year for profitability, partly because a lot of its costs actually declined. So the cost of sales, people didn't travel to go and see clients, but markets were strong, and so flows were very good. Obviously there is considerable wealth and income inequality, but for those people who were well paid, who are often clients of the investment sector, their disposable income actually went up because they weren't able to travel on holiday, they weren't able to spend their money in other ways, and so investment flows into the UK went up as well. So we had a situation in the UK, at least, where there was a decline in costs to the sector and an increase in revenues, which we don't expect to necessarily continue. But the other last point to note is actually one of the areas that we are concerned about is the behavior of investment professionals. And I think it was difficult for some investment professionals working remotely from one another. The investment is a knowledge industry. And while it is possible to share knowledge through meetings such as this, you miss, and our members said that they missed the opportunity to meet face to face and to have the opportunity to engage with people. And we run an annual survey. And one of the comments that we had back was that investment professionals were more concerned about their duty to perform really in-depth company analysis because they were not able to go and meet company management. They weren't able to meet the people running the businesses that they were investing in. They obviously could do that online, but that's a more managed environment, and it's more difficult to have those face-to-face meetings where you can throw in a difficult question that maybe management isn't expecting and that the management then has to respond to. So there are some benefits and disadvantages, I think, of having lived through the pandemic purely from an investment perspective. I mean, clearly it's been a very miserable and devastating episode for many people. But we are looking forward to the end of this strange period of working and very much looking forward to coming together again.
Vă așteptăm cu drag în România atunci, dacă la anul condițiile vor fi mult mai prielnice și vom putea să derulăm evenimente fizice.
And we shall be able to develop face-to-face meetings. Another question is, what is the demand for these ESG certifications? What kind of demand do you have?
We have demand from a broader range
Avem
of
cerere de la
roles within the investment profession and perhaps for the
de
CFA
roluri
program. So a lot of the people who study for the CFA program are analysts or investment managers. And we have many analysts and investment managers who are taking the certificate in ESG investing. But we also see a lot of demand from people working in middle office roles in the areas of product development, of distribution, but also even from areas such as compliance, and also from those people who have a responsibility to engage with policymakers and regulators. It's a very good way for people to develop a good understanding of the world of sustainable investing quickly. While it requires something in the order of about 100 hours of study, so it isn't, people need to plan ahead to think about how they can build it into their work schedule. Most of the people who take the exam pass it. We have a pass rate of 75% roughly. We are testing really that people have studied rather than trying to separate the groups and only take through the very best. What we want to know is that everybody in the sector, and we've designed the certificate this way, is that we believe that everybody should have a certain level of knowledge and ability around ESG. And so as long as people can prove that they've attained that, we're delighted to award them the certificate.
Mulțumesc și pentru că știu că agenda dumneavoastră este puțin strânsă astăzi, aș vrea să profit de timpul dumneavoastră și să vă mai adresez o întrebare acum. Cristi Pascu a vorbit despre investițiile transfrontaliere. În contextul Brexit, cum vedeți impactul Brexit asupra industriei de asset management la nivel european și la nivel de UK?
I think it is probably still a little bit early to tell, but after the Brexit vote, it became apparent that large international investment management firms based in the UK would need to ensure that their offices in European countries were properly staffed and that they had proper representation of the investment function within those different centers. And we have seen, I think, probably a slight slowdown in recruitment into the UK, and a corresponding increase in recruitment into offices in the EU outside the UK. In terms of the sort of the regulatory relationship between the EU and the UK, clearly we're still in the early phase where things had been left very much as they were, and we had transposed the EU regulation essentially. And what we will see, I suppose, over the next few years is whether or not there is a divergence between the two in the areas in which there might be. And my expectation is that there won't be any significant divergence because so much of the UK investment profession, or the investment sector, where a lot of the assets in the European market are managed, depends on access to the EU. So we will always be extremely concerned and interested in maintaining that access. But there may be areas such as the use of different taxonomies for the decision-making around what counts around sustainable investment, in terms of sort of social taxonomy and how that works, or green taxonomy and how that works. There were some critics in the UK that the EU taxonomy was very, it wasn't very nuanced, and it was quite specific at certain levels. And would this always necessarily be useful for those who are trying to take a sustainable investing approach? And so there may in due course be some differentiation between the operation of taxonomies in the UK and the EU, but we will have to wait and see how that evolves.
Mulțumesc foarte mult, Will Goodhart.
Thank you very much, Will Goodhart. Milan, how was the pandemic for the investment industry in Romania? It was like a roller coaster. That is, we moved them from agony during the last 2 years, period in which we've learned many things. If we were experts in geopolitics, since 2 years ago we've become to be experts in medical issues, or in calculating vaccination rates in various corners of the world. We had been dealing with a turmoil of emotions. In March, we tried to manage the fear of investment of investors, and we tried to see what was the impact of the unforeseen events. And right now we are in the era of greed management, or a certain euphoria, because the exchange indexes are pretty surprising. It seems that the recent crisis in 2008, when the market digested better the volatility, and we have a new word that we use nowadays, that is resilience. I would say that the asset management market was very resilient to the risk it has been subject to, including in Romania, and we have consolidated the foundation for what we could do in the future years. Now we have to collect the benefits of this period, because we've learned to adjust, we've learned to base ourselves on our own forces. We've learned that we must consolidate a financial status, we must consolidate things, and we must be able to go through events and unforeseen moments with better openness and more attention. So I would say it has been a good period. The numbers say the same thing, but it is really important to keep building upon these events and not to let the emotions influence our financial status. Influence what, Cristian, what is your opinion about this period? Yes, I have the same opinion. We've come from agony to an ecstatic situation, but we've learned many things. I would say that the asset management industry has come out even stronger from this pandemic, because if we were really scared at the beginning, since we've experienced all those withdrawals in March last year, and we also had a drop of assets of 3.7 billion lei, partially because of withdrawals, partially because of prices, and then the price dropped sharply, and there wasn't too much liquidity. So that's why we experience a drop in prices. Subsequently, the industry recovered, in a very good way. So we've had some withdrawals during the first 2 quarters, but there were small withdrawals, let's say. And as of last year, we've already had a positive outcome, but we still need to recover around 350, 400 million, since we were talking about 3.7 billion RON. As observer, as depositary, so I'm not involved in asset management, so I observed that all funds had a good position, has a really good position. Although we had withdrawals, they could manage the settlements, and they managed to do well in certain situations. I've seen really robust procedures. I believe that this is an area which wouldn't have been strong in other times. So the industry proved that it is stronger nowadays. In my capacity as member of the board of the association, I'm happy to see that the industry came out in a positive way from this situation, and I'm convinced that the trend is positive. Of course, we are all asking ourselves how much can the market increase. We shall see. So we have a positive trend, but I think it is good to celebrate such events and not just ask questions about when the decrease will start. So the fact that we were able to attract so many issuers, we already exceed the historical maximums, so this makes us optimistic about the future periods. We still have the status of emergent market, but we have more and more issuers, and I'm convinced that we are on the right track. From the category of lessons learned, I would say that if we had some projects set up at the level of the industry, which stipulated the digitalization, automatization within 3 or 4 years, the pandemic proved us that these things can be done in a few months. So we've moved on from documents which were signed only face to face, and at a very fast pace, everybody accepted signing documents electronically. Everybody accepted to offer loans online. We already have loans which are granted 100% online. So let's look on the bright side. All these changes would have happened in 3 or 5 years, and things have changed at a very fast pace, and this shows us that if you really want something, you can do it. So we actually needed an impulse, something to make us look in the same direction. So what's next? This is my next question, actually. Horia said, following yesterday's discussions, that the funds are actually that the funds hinder the inflation, and we are about to see a period of inflation. So what are your expectations with respect to the evolution of the industry in a global context? So the expectations are optimistic. Of course, the economic context recommend diversification, a fast diversification, a wide diversification of portfolios. As we said earlier, we must manage the expectations because we will have some risks. In this respect, the market must remember, especially investors should remember, that there is volatility. We have a difficult local context from the perspective perspective of predictability. And in this context, we must adjust, we must individually adjust our expectations. There's not a uniform recipe for everybody, so we must adjust ourselves individually. And things shall be developed slowly. We shall see new products on the market. We shall see this sustainability component more and more present. And this sectorial division will play an important role because it is good to have all opportunities opened, and we must benefit from all these opportunities in order to have our portfolios prepared for anything that happens on the market. From an investitional perspective, it is good to fight against this inflation because there's a pressure on the market, on the markets with fixed instruments. We see that people preferred a certain type of instruments. And at the same time, we must see that the contribution of all the players to the market created a good investment market in difficult conditions. We are even referring to the central bank, which stabilized things when the volatility was going crazy. So we believe this is a context when the management market can increase. Of course, this partnership between the management and distribution area must be at least as tight as it was beforehand. We are talking about a market of volumes, but we want to see more players, more distributors, and we want to see a more competitive market, a deeper market, let's say. Cristian, what's your opinion about the future? I think we will have many challenges in this industry. I think yesterday we said that the management represent around 5%, and the colleagues in the region already have a percentage formed of two figures. So this is a beautiful increase and we have great perspectives, but there are a few things that I would like to underline. First of all, the introduction of global accounts. I think we are one of the few markets in Europe which works with individual accounts, with subscription to managers. I think it is a good opportunity to move on to global accounts. Direct subscription to the bank has a series of shortages. We all know that all foreign accounts are global accounts, and I think, for example, if a manager wants to make a subscription through another distributor, that distributor must communicate on a daily basis all the details related to the investors, to their transactions, because we are talking about a competitional market. And because we have a competitional market, they don't want to offer information about their clients. And if we have this concept of global account, you no longer have to communicate the data about your clients. For example, somebody comes into your bank and can buy funds in any other manager. So once the information is sent to the partner, that is to the asset manager, it would have been like telling him, you should do your best with this client. So for a distributor, it's not convenient to communicate the names of its clients. So when the market implements this global account, things will be better. I know there are some discussions at the level of authorities. There are some differences as well, and let's hope that we will be able to modify the legislation by next year. And this thing will contribute to the development of the industry for sure. Another aspect which shall also be a challenge is the fund authorization area. We work with the Financial Supervisory Authority in order to standardize things, everything takes time, and it is important at the level of the authority to launch these standardized prospects, because there are only a few fields one must fill in, that is the characteristics of the fund, and the fund should be able to be launched within a couple of months. Another aspect that the market should be focused on for the next 2 years are the consultancy services, because for the moment there are few people offering consultancy, and we know that the investor needs education, and in order to do that you need to offer consultancy. From my point of view, the industry does not attract investors because you need to take your time to explain things according to the investitional profile, according to the profile you perform for the client. You must offer a wide range of funds and the client must choose. But the consultancy services need to become a must on the whole market. I would also mention the digital platforms. It is important, they are important because we want to attract the younger generation in this industry. We want to be able to offer the possibility to an investor to subscribe using various devices, applications. An investor should no longer go to the bank in order to do so. So if the investor has the necessary information, he should be able to make an investment in a few clicks. So we are talking about a generation which no longer has the patience to do various things, which is focused on smartphones, digitalization. So we must move towards this area. Another aspect that we should focus on is related to the education of investors, and I'm talking about the subscription area. So it is widely accepted for the investors that if somebody comes from outside, a commission should be paid. So why should we pay a subscription commission? Because this is a payment that should be made only for the sale effort. And then we move on to inducements. We cannot consider inducement if we offer the investor other income other than that related to the recovery of the distribution costs, and or this distribution cost or these commissions should pertain to the to the distributors. So I think the market should direct itself to this area. Another aspect which shall contribute to the increase of the investors' interest is the automatic payment. It is a common effort with the stock market. We are trying to convince the authorities to do so because the investors are reluctant when it comes to the bureaucracy, because it's all about statements, calculation. So a simplified process where the investor has fewer steps to do, I think will be helpful for the industry. We are on the right track. There are good initiatives launched but we need some time. Thank you. You also talked about the fact that the younger generation is more attracted by the trading platforms which are easier to use, where you can open an account easier. They are also attracted by riskier investments. I'm talking about cryptocurrency. What shall we do for the younger generation to move on the right path of investments? So what shall we do in order to attract them to the investment funds? The approach is very important, and the way we connect to these investment groups. We are talking about a new generation which must be approached the way, in a way they enjoy. The traditional methods are not successful. We are talking about a gamification concept of the investment area, and we try to implement it every time we can, at least at the level of student associations specialized on the economic area. So there are small battles we must win, and we must offer the instruments, as Cristi said, that is the digital trading platforms for mutual funds. We also must offer the instruments for understanding these mutual funds. And this manual must not be very thick, because we know they like to see fast information, information that is easy to understand. On the other hand, we must perceive the reality of the financial markets from the perspective of the performances. It's clear that there's a high interest with respect to performances. We must all understand that this is not a typical period, and things are evolving at a fast pace, and each of us must start from the idea of financial planning together with certain expectations they've set for the future. Otherwise, the market is like a bull that can run over you if you're not well grounded. And in this respect, I believe that the newsletters and the webinars, including today's conferences, offer additional information. And we are talking about a marathon that the management industry must run in order to become more relevant. Because in the end, we must be relevant. We must offer the instruments that certain investors may choose or not. We must be part of the financial planning for as many Romanians as possible. Our comparison to the region is positive. On the other hand, Romania has a good start because we start from a lower level, but we are a market which is very open to new things. We are aligned to new trends related to technology, for example, in a much faster pace than other countries in the region. And we have a better traction than our neighbors, and we can do better moving forward. You've mentioned beforehand that this is a period full of pressure for fixed funds. At the same time, we must be prepared for periods of volatility. Do you think that Romanian investors shall resort to stock funds? Yes, I think that visibility of the capital market, of the stock exchange, has increased during the last years. We see new issuers at the stock market, and we see these new companies as integral part of the mutual funds we manage. So clearly that this diversification process must continue. The footprint of the bonds fund is of the securities fund funds is higher. It is clearly that the interest shall increase on the medium and long term. So in this context, we must look for other alternatives, but the transition should be made at the pace that each investor can assimilate, even if the market does not offer guarantees, but it offers affiliation on the medium and long term. And Romania has an optimistic scenario for the next years, and the stock exchange is the best instrument for you to align yourself to this process of maximization of the Romanian economy. And everything we see in our country, from infrastructure to capital market, is turned into opportunities through consistent approach. And we are talking about the moment when we start to do that, not the moment when the financial market shall offer the highest return on investment. You must start earlier, and you must be determined in this investitional process. We will be more and more dependent on our weapons or currencies for solving our future financial challenges up to the retirement age. And it's time for action. This is my main message. We should not wait. Waiting means losing time, and time is the most important resource. Indeed, capital market has become more and more visible during the last period. We have been an emerging market for a year with 5 companies, 5 distribution companies. The liquidity has improved, maybe not at the desired level, but still improved. Christy, my question is, what would be helpful for liquidity? And I'm referring to stock loans. As far as I know, they are pretty low. Yes, I would say that there have been some tests on the market, some occasional tests on the market in order to see if this works. From my point of view, it is absolutely necessary to have what we are all expecting. Things have been delayed. I think this will be a stimulus for the capital market, because people prefer not to have a position on the long term, and the stock loans represent a blockage. I know they are working on it. I'm sure that everything will be done in the end, but it is also true that this would have been a good period for CCP. Of course, things would have been better. We must not complain. Things are pretty good as they are. On the other hand, we must be aware of the fact that market must take into consideration the volatility. Of course, we will have times when the market will be in decline. Who analyzes this volatility undertakes all these risks, but as an investment term, we must have a medium and long term. I think the investors are used to capital market, are used to the stock exchange. It is a good time to have good investors. I know we have over 100 investors in the asset management area, which is a good thing. I'm convinced that there are many investors, new investors listed on the stock exchange directly. So I think that the stock funds had a lot to gain in this period. Also, the securities funds must be taken into consideration together with the increase of interest. So these securities funds shall be brought to our attention again. We must have a mixture. We must not choose a single instrument. We must have diversification. We must not analyze prices every day. The emotion is important as well, as Adina said, and it is good to let things operate on a medium and long term. So everybody who has analyzed things on medium long term had all the things to gain. So let's see what will happen to BNRR, because the general context is really good for Romania. We shall have financings, we shall have investments in infrastructure. We must only have the will to do everything. But I have I'm optimistic about the capital management, capital market, about asset management, and I'm happy that we were able to attract this impressive number of investors. And I want to believe that this is due to our company as well, because we've been present on all channels, in media, in written publications, on TV. I think we managed to reach areas which haven't been reached before. We must continue this initiative because we must be aware of the fact that we must educate our investors, we must invest in their education. Even banks invest in their education. For example, my bank has a project with Școala de Bani, the money school. We have various interventions in the media area, and we are trying to increase, to have a good development, and it is important to keep doing that. It's important to keep doing this education, because without education, without understanding the concepts of investment and savings, we cannot move forward. Thank you for congratulations for your financial education initiatives. Before moving on, because you talked about BNRR, which is a very hot topic, we have organized the form of capital markets, and one of the ideas was, why shouldn't we co-finance the projects we have, both from European funds and European programs and from the capital market. So we should have a mixture between the two sources of financing. What is your opinion about this idea? This is not a new idea. We've always had discussions on this topic. You know that the pension funds has the possibility to perform infrastructure investments, can perform public and private partnerships, but they don't quite do it. Yes, they don't quite do it. So we have the context, we have this initiative, but I think this program doesn't mean a lack of financing, but a lack of political will of doing things. Of course, we can search for new partners in these projects, but if the authorities want, of course, we can we can have these partners. As you know, there is liquidity on the market, and I can assure you that this is the case. It is not an issue of liquidity, it is an issue of will, of engagement in a partnership on a long term. So we must have the will to do things, we must want to do things. Thank you.
A fost un interes foarte mare în ultima perioadă pe piața aero. Am văzut destul de multe listări de dimensiuni mai mici.
We've had a good number of listings. They were pretty small indeed. We've seen that the Bucharest Stock Exchange will launch an index for the aero market. So you, as an industry, are looking at this particular market. Is that of interest to you? Well, yes, this is a growth engine of the capital market. For the time being, they are pretty small, and they are pretty hard to consider for the mutual funds. Well, we like to see new businesses, new industries that are represented here. I mean, industries that are not there yet, because in this way the main indexes of the Bucharest Stock Exchange can become more relevant to Romania's economy. Because right now energy creates a little bit of an imbalance. Romania does much more than that, and more industries should be represented there. There are also some speculative movements. We try to have a pretty, a different approach. We need to wait and see what will be happening, but signals are pretty good. What is drawing the attention to me is the area of the corporate bonds, the so-called high-yield bonds that are present on the aero market too. Investors should be looking at this topic with great attention, and should really be careful about the output rates. Well, we hope to see more development in the years to come. Well, Cristian Hostiuc asked yesterday the panelists when they had invested in a fund for the first time. I'd like to ask you if your friends are investing in a fund. Have you talked them into investing, and how did you do it? Well, I've convinced some of my friends, and this is not an easy task, because friends do have the most difficult questions, but this is very good, and I think this is elementary and basic. Even the investment programs that Romania's investors are applying play a very important role when it comes to developing Romania's retail market, and the beginning is very good. But there has to be a very clear cap on everything. So maybe it's not relevant to invest 3,500 lei per hour, per month, sorry. I think people want to see tangible things. People need to be working on their savings plan. People need to understand that they can save very efficiently if they have a plan, but they also have to undertake the risks. In time, people can build on their experience, can have predictable investments, and can take more relevant steps into the future. Well, this sort of investment is a very long and winding road. Financial planning is a long and winding road, but financial planning will be yielding results in the upcoming years. People who made an investment decisions 4 years ago, 5 years ago, are already seeing a lot of benefits. Their savings are growing, so they are making more investments and more diversified. Cristian, what about you? Have you talked to your friends into investing? Well, yes, my relatives relied on me because I've been working in this particular industry for a good number of years. So basically, I was their advisor. I worked free of charge, and I did it just, in a friendly manner to show them that investment can be done. But I advise them to forget about the money they put into these investments. I advise them to refrain from having a look just every other day. They should be looking every month, depending on the fund they are choosing and depending on other conditions. Or more interesting was with the friends, because they had seen me in several occasions when I was speaking as part of our smart investment projects. So I tried to show them that this was the best instrument for them, even in circumstances where the interest rates were quite low, the euro would not yield anything. So I did show them that things can happen with each and every currency. You can get better yields. You're basically relying on investors and on advisors to invest your money. These people are professionals. These people know exactly what they have to do. And although there's a disclaimer that the past performances is not a guarantee for the future ones, the best thing is to hire a professional investor. If you don't find a professional investor, then you should be putting your money into investment funds, because they have several people there. They make investments in the medium run, in the long run, and it's a proven fact that these funds are doing their very best to make proper investments. And I'm convinced that a lot of my friends have invested into these funds. I advise them not to be blinded by the positive trends. I advise them to look at their money more rarely, because money grows in the long run. Also, people are keeping their eyes on these trends. We have this economisește inteligent, smart savings project, which is very interesting. It's made a lot of steps. It has progressed a lot. People are happy with it and optimistic, and this also show a trend in our industry. One of the global trends when it comes to industry, according to the studies, a trend that we haven't covered too much today, is associated to the bespoke experiences of clients. Christy said something about consulting. What do you think? These bespoke products, are they requested in Romania or not? Well, there is a demand in Romania for that, but you need to walk before you run, as they say. Advice is also being sought, and the legislation is helping. There was a fear when things began about the cumbersome reporting requirements and other requirements and the operational costs, but we are trying to get closer to the retail actors whose experience is a little bit on the low side. Also, we need to have products that are easy to understand and easy to operate beyond the platforms that we are providing, helping investors to build their portfolios. We also need to provide other portfolios that are easier to understand. We are also encouraging the multi-asset funds that combine several matters very smartly. We are now at a phase where Romanian customers are trying to calibrate their expectations depending on the risks that they are willing to take. But before you make an investment, you need to look at the risks. Risks are very important to understand, but risks are balanced backed by opportunities. Romanians seem to be on the pessimistic side in many occasions, but I'm encouraging them to be more optimistic and to start looking at the benefits, not at the disadvantages. We are now at the outset. We are now proposing something which is more sophisticated. Things need to be taken gradually. Well, thank you. Cristian, what about the demand of bespoke solutions in Romania? What is your opinion? Well, I'm sharing Milan's opinion. This is at the outset, so this is just the beginning. There are some demands coming above all from the private banking area. Well, I wouldn't say that this is too much of a trend, but you know, these requests are there and have been around for some time. I like to get back to what I said before. This consulting service needs to be implemented throughout the entire industry, but it's also necessary to have global accounts, because in the future it will become more difficult to manage a wide range of products given the current conditions, and you need to provide customers with an option to have multi-asset investments. And you need to have several accounts for that. I believe that this is a very good time to enable Romanian clients to use global accounts. I believe that the global accounts will provide benefits to our industry, and there will be a time when all banks will be providing consulting services like these ones. Will have global accounts, will have taxes withheld at source, because this is very important for the seller of the product. So all of these issues will contribute to entities being encouraged to provide the whole package, because it's not enough to provide like a basis of things. You need to provide the entire package. So for the time being, those who do provide these services are lacking some things, but we're trying to point things into the right direction, to set things on the right track. Thank you, Cristian. Now we are getting closer to the end of today's discussion. For those who've joined the discussion a little bit later, what's the takeaway? What are the prospects in just a couple of words? Milan, what do you think? Well, this is a favorable juncture. This is favorable to investments. We need to understand investments. We need to adjust ourselves to the unforeseen. Well, the pandemic has taught us that things can change overnight, and this happens in the world of investment all the time, but we need to think positively. We need to think of that positive prospects are awaiting us. Diversification is the most important tool helping us think that way. Also, some other savings and investment options should be considered, different from what we've been familiar with over the past 10 years. We need to overcome the phase of denial and move on to the phase of involvement. It's a pity to miss opportunities, and it's also, we should also be linking our financial prosperity to Romania's positive outlooks. What about Cristian? Well, I agree. The juncture that we're living through right now is very good. It's unprecedented. we have some historical maximum rates right now. We are now having a context where the asset management industry is growing. It's becoming more visible too. A lot of things have happened, and authorities seem to be pretty open and willing. There are these alternative investment funds that are quite interesting. I expect to see ever more alternative management funds wanting to do business in the private banking, in the private equity. I expect these entities to get registered with the FSA and launch new funds in Romania too. And these funds should be registered with our financial supervisory authority. Also, for the year 2021, I expect to have the option to have our taxes withheld at source. We also expect to go global with some of our investments. Well, there is some volatility on this market. We shouldn't forget about that. And things will be going down on some slopes at some point. At some point, prospects and outlooks may seem to be on the negative side, but we need to be looking at the future, because it's always about the future and the long-term investments when we work in this particular market. In our previous meeting, we were discussing the action plan of the capital markets. So it has been just released when we had the previous conference. This will happen again. Some indicators will be reviewed. Also, all of these regulations that are coming up from the European Union will have an impact on us. So every now and then, even the EU regulations are reviewed and updated. The EU has a very clear calendar for updating these regulations, and this will have an impact on our industry in the distribution area. Well, I expect SRT2 and the CSDR to have an impact on our operational side of things and on the disbursements. When it comes to CSDR, we'll also see the so-called de-passporting, and we should be enjoying the good times that the market is going through right now, and we need to be optimistic. Well, let's be optimistic. Thank you so much for this discussion. Cristian, Milan, Will, thank you so much for the picture you've drawn about the UK's CFA funds. Well, this is a good timing for investment. This is what I'm taking from this discussion. We need to be ready for volatility as well. As investors, we need to look at long-term investments. We don't have to look every day at the quotations in order not to get too emotional. Of course, that we need to look at the legal framework in terms of trends, well, sustainable investments in the ESG products, digitalization, de-bureaucratization, and also breaking the cross-border barriers. Of course, education needs to be there all the time. We need to be connected to everything that's new. Financial intelligence remains a partner of the investment funds. You can count on us. We will always be sharing information with you, information about industry trends and information about the local capital market and about the investment funds. I would like to congratulate the Association of the Investment Funds for this third summit. I've been here with you Thank you for your attention, and please stay here with Stelian Muscalu as of 12 hours. He will be talking inter alia about alternative investments. Thank you so much. Good luck. Well, hello. Welcome back. Since this is the second summit of the fund managers that I participate in Romania, I am very happy to be here with you again. Well, last year we were holding this summit at a time when we didn't know much. Romania's economy was breathing with great difficulty under the pressure of the pandemic, which was in full swing. Back then, people were afraid about the deflation. So basically, everything was spiraling down. Now, in theory, we're living through better times, at least in theory. Economy goes well, there is a lot of money on the market. We are on the other part of the hill of our fears associated to inflation. And some say that inflation is temporary. Other analysts say that because of the large amounts of money available on the market, the inflation can go into the long run. That is why central banks right now make important decisions about their monetary policies. Well, I was saying that theoretically we are living through some good times. I was looking at the news, we have a 6.33 rate. We are thinking again about the lockdown. We are thinking about last year's questions. Well, in the past, we used to know nothing about vaccines. We were thinking about vaccines, we're thinking about the economy. Now we have the vaccine, the vaccine that could save us all. And this vaccine could delete the idea of the lockdown off the list of problems that everybody considers. Well, right now, everybody fears. Well, this is the second day of the debate. The public is a little bit stressed. People fear that we could lose our public, but this is not going to happen. That is why I would like to propose to change the format just a little bit. And the previous panels have been extremely interesting with very hot topics that are adding value to the conversation. And I would like to propose, as it was suggested to me by Mr. Schroll, to organize like a round table, bringing us together, enabling us to interact and to ask each other things and to keep the discussion going. And this would be quite appealing to the public, the online public. So the challenge of the public is to abandon the distractions inherent in the social networks and think of their investment needs. Because now, you know, I am just a moderator, but you know, these are people with experience, with a long track record in this particular line of work, and these people can provide advice and added value. At the end of the day, this experience can be translated into money in a very tangible manner. So I will be letting these people talk. These people have a long-standing track record. Please let us interact. So if you have questions, please ask your questions so that at the end of the day, at the end of the conversation, there are no questions when it comes to the investment funds. I would like to ask Mr. Schroll to deliver the opening speech. There are many questions that I would like to ask, but I would like to start with the first question. Maybe we'll be getting to others as well, so everybody should have a chance to present their ideas. Well, the first question: is there any competition between the private equity funds and the investment funds, or the activity of the two sorts of entities are complementary to each other? Da, mulțumesc. Bună ziua tuturor. Eu sunt Matjaz Schroll, sunt șef
in Central Eastern Europe, and have been doing that for 16 years. So maybe before I answer your question, I think that Romania is not aware enough of its success and importance in private equity in Central Eastern Europe in particular, but actually in Europe as well. Because in this year, in my view, an event in Romania happened that is equal to if Romania has won a European football championship. And that is that UiPath listed in US with a market capitalization, which at the time of the listing was around 35 billion. Currently, it's around 27 billion. And this makes UiPath, one of the biggest or the biggest technology company coming out of Central Eastern Europe, which is a tremendous success, and which is also putting Romania firmly on the map of a technologically advanced companies and on the regions where there is ample room for development of technology companies. Now, why am I starting with that? Because I think that UiPath is a prime example of, you know, interaction between private equity funds and public funds. Why? Because if you look into 2015, UiPath has been a small loss-making company with a big dream, but a very small and insignificant. And through venture capital investment, it has been nurtured within 5 years to have a market cap which is bigger than the entire set of the companies listed on the Romanian Stock Exchange. And hopefully, you know, this will lead to other unicorns coming from Romania. Actually, there are already some. And in that sense, you can see that the interplay between the private investors investing in companies like UiPath and public investors, once these companies come into the public markets, is very important. So to answer your question, private equity and investment funds investing in listed equity are completely complementary and need each other in order to further develop the ecosystem of successful companies.
Există pentru cele două tipuri de fonduri domenii de interes. Am văzut cu ce se ocupă UiPath-ul, cum a intrat în această zonă a activităților repetitive, a venit cu o serie de, eu știu, automatizări și iată, a ajuns primul unicorn
of automations. Now it's Romania's first unicorn, and it creates an outstanding impression on the capital markets. Well, I would like to ask you whether there are areas of interest for these two sorts of funds, the financial, energy, medical. What do you think?
So in terms of interest, what we are seeing across the globe and what COVID also accelerated is the two key trends. So one is digitalization, which goes across the different industries, and the other one is a disruption, which is a result of this digitalization. So basically, what we believe is of interest is not just the individual industries, but are these two processes and the companies that are pushing these processes ahead. So in that sense, all of the industries that you mentioned are of interest. But for example, if we are talking the financial industry, then for sure it's fintech, because fintech is the digitalization and disruption. If we go into other industries, for example, into the retail, it's e-commerce and everything related to e-commerce in terms of last mile logistics and stuff like that. So in that sense, anything that accelerates digitalization and disruption is of high interest, because what we've seen through COVID is that COVID actually accelerated those developments across all the industries, in our estimate, by 4 or 5 years. So whatever we were expecting in 2019 to happen by 2025 happened by 2021. So, and for that reason, this change and pace of change accelerated, and that's why alternative investment funds are so important, because these funds are providing finances for these big changes that we are seeing across the industries. So therefore, I think it's less about the individual industries, but it's more about the companies that are disrupting the established business models that are of the highest interest for investors like us.
Aș vrea să mergem la doamna Bobircă, e CIO partner CFS.
To Madam Bobircă, she is a CFO partner within CFS, and we would like to continue this discussion. And I'm wondering, how can the private equity funds industry can help the investment fund industry and the other way around? Because we've seen they are complementary. How can they help each other? Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here with you and to take part in the discussions. As you promised, they shall be quite intense discussions. I would begin by saying that the alternative investment funds represent at European level around 40% of the investment fund industry. We've seen in the previous presentation that in Romania this is an even higher percentage. There are various classes of assets included in these alternative investments. Private equity would be one category, not the most representative, but one of the most dynamic lately. Also with a significant increase pace, we are talking about real estate, infrastructure, natural resources. So all these categories which increased during the last few years. So how can the two funds help each other as part of the industry of alternative investment funds? So what can the private equity funds offer? Of course, we are talking about diversification opportunity for the portfolios. Plus, in the context you presented at the beginning, they could ensure better protection against inflation, better returns on investment, lower volatility, even the possibility to reach objectives such as sustainability, so a contribution to the climate targets. We already see that this post-COVID economic cycle is dominated by inflation, and the investment in these tangible assets and private equity can meet the expectations of the investors by providing a better protection against inflation, and even in the perspective of better returns on investment. If we were to look at the statistics and analysis available and to make a comparison according to similar hypotheses for a 10-year period, we could say that in Europe, this private equity industry has had better yields than the public investments, where the basis points are around 200 to 230. So we have a confirmation of good yields. The source of these yields for private equity specifically is some sort of convergence between what we believe to be a unique investment opportunity, but also a set of skills, abilities of the management teams, which lead towards this bonus determined by the sophistication degree of the investments, let's say complexity bonus or a bonus for skills, let's say. With respect to the volatility, I would interpret things as the lack of liquidity for private equity is a certainty and an option for the investors, and is undertaken as of the onset. So in this case, we are talking about a choice, not about a risk related to private equity. I would like to say a few words, if I may. Mr. Bobircă. I hope that you will discover that I have many things to say on this topic, but it is more interesting if we have such contributions. So this allows me to convey a message. Thank you for your invitation. My name is Horia Manda. I'm a managing partner at România, one of the companies with the longest history in Romania, over 24 years. And I'm still a president of the Romanian Private Equity Association and Venture Capital. As Ana said, this differentiation between private equity funds and alternative investment funds is artificial because private equity funds are actually risk capital alternative funds. So it is all related to the origin of the capital and the jurisdictions where these funds have been standardized. To go back in history in the sense of facilitating my message, the venture capital funds and private equity funds, irrespective of their type, have been active in Romania since 1995, since the setup of the alternative investment funds. So they were organized as collective placement bodies. Following the development of the slow development of the private equity investments in Romania, the Private Equity Association in Romania was established in 1995 and initially was named SARS System Private Association because it wanted to be a comprehensive body, including for the few players, regional players, who were undertaking activities in Romania. Many things have changed because the industry developed in other countries as well, such as Bulgaria or other Balkan countries. So recently our organization changed its name into the Romanian Private Equity Association. Europea includes funds within the regions, so we prefer jurisdictions such as Holland or Luxembourg. And my answer to your question, how can the private equity industry can help the alternative investment funds, is the following. The two industries can help each other by through the collaboration through the two professional associations, that is Europea and the Association of Alternative Investment Funds. And as President of Romanian Private Equity Association, I want to thank you for your invitation, and I would like to launch a collaboration proposal, a permanent collaboration proposal at the level of associations and managements in order to debate common topics, especially with respect to regulation, which is meant to support the development of these investments in Romania. I also salute the recent activity of RSP related to the activity of investment funds, and we have reiterated Europea's position in the sense of simplifying the regulations, both with respect to the authorization and to the respect to the reporting. This is the most efficient way the two industries can collaborate, that is through their associations, through their professional associations. Thank you for these specifications. We have a question. So I will I will ask the questions when they are asked by the interested people, because we don't want to make them wait till the end of the panel. So we have a question from Madam Bobirka from Mr. Ionita, who can invest in private equities. We are talking about a class of assets meant for professionals investors. There are some access tickets according to the profile of the funds. So these types of funds comprise these profiles. So Mr. Ionita, let's say he has an amount of money and would like to access this area. What he should do? It's quite complicated, but let's try. It's not complicated. I don't know the extent to which, since I don't know Mr. Ioniță, I don't know his investment profile, but he should have the necessary knowledge in order to be able to undertake such investitional profile. This is the sum up. Of course, there are such funds which can be accessed through listing, I mean alternative funds, which are meant for retail investors as well. Maybe he can invest as retail investors as he invests in any other type of listed company. And in this case, the threshold for accessing such investments is pretty low. Thank you. I would like to go to Mr. Cîrciumaru, who is a managing partner for V7 Capital, has an experience of over 15 years, and I would like to ask him how is it to be an investor on the Romanian market, because we have some economical and political instability. And the two of them are interconnected. Hello, and thank you for invitation. Of course, I'm an investor within the venture capital area, and not only, I also seek other classes of assets. I would like to have some small observations related to the previous discussions. That is, the segregation between the two funds is rather an artificial segregation. I don't consider it to exclude one or the other funds. So the two classes of assets are quite different. There is a good complementarity between the two, and the venture capital area can become an important pipeline for the private equity funds. And of course, we can discuss many details about that, but it takes too much time. But what I would like to mention briefly is the fact that we see more and more capital allocated to venture capital in Romania, and this is seen not as we have seen in the private equity area, but I would like to underline the fact that the venture capital area in Romania developed at a fast pace during the last 5 years. I've been an entrepreneur. I have set up a company in 2011, which I sold 2 years ago. So in 2011, if you wanted to have access to capital from the venture area in Romania, there were few such investors in Romania. There were not, plus the funds were not as today. But 10 years ago, you did not have venture capital investors you could resort to. So this option was somehow inexistent in Romania. What has been happening during the last 5 years, it is a really fast acceleration of the venture capital assets, and I'm convinced that as long as this class develops, as long as there are many companies which exit this asset class, they will become a target for the private equity area and later even for other types of alternative funds. So naturally, this complementarity between the venture funds, early stage companies, and those which invest in the later life cycle of companies should increase, since we see more and more capital directed to the venture capital area. You also talked about, and Matjaz had a great answer about the interest domain for which feedback is very important, and this includes the e-commerce area, cybersecurity area, and gaming security. Again, specifically talking about the venture capital area. I would also like to refer, with respect to the previous question, as far as I know, since I'm not an investor in the private equity area, as they, according to their proper definition, so the access is pretty easy, the amounts are pretty high. In exchange, and I go back to my domain of interest, that is the venture capital area, an important thing which has happened here during the last 2 years, the accelerated increase due specifically to the crowdfunding for the venture capital area. So it is an easy way to access these investments in startups, so early stage company with low amounts. As far as I know, the minimum access ticket is 1,000 euros, so it is more accessible to small investors, which are not necessarily professional investors. So this is what I wanted to say about the access to this asset class, that is alternative funds, because they are all alternative investment funds. This is one opportunity. As far as I know, for the private equity funds, we don't have crowdfunding, and I'm not mistaken, maybe on the foreign market we have, but not in Romania. But we have this venture capital area, and this helps the industry a lot. So I kind of had a brief presentation of everything which has happened before. And moving on to the next question, I believe that investing in Romania in this period, of course taking into account the economic, political environment, I'm referring to the regulation area, I'm not referring to the politics per se. So there's a tight connection, of course, between the quality of the politics and the quality of the regulation. It's a direct connection between the two. It is a roller coaster because the regulation part doesn't help the alternative funds, especially the venture capital investment class. I wouldn't say that it hinders this class, but certainly the regulation area is not a helpful area for gaining access to this asset class. I know what it means to invest in a startup. I know all the bureaucracy, and the fact that this is extremely cumbersome. It takes a long time, and we must go through many stages and connections to many institutions. Everything delays the capital turnover, which brings about lower yields. Time is the enemy of any investor, because the slower we turn, the slower the capital flows, the lower the yields will be. So this is kind of a political area, and I don't want to linger on it, but Matjaz started the discussion really well, underlining this success, because we have no idea how important it is for Romanian and for the future of the venture capital industry and for the investment area in Romania, what the success of this company means, both through the capital entering in Romania due to this success, but also because the trust is consolidated in everything that the alternative funds mean. So this is unprecedented, and it is a ball which once started, it is difficult to stop. Of course, due to the economic cyclicity, there might be slowdowns, but in my opinion, we are on the right track. And things can only go from good to better and great. I don't want to detail things too much. This is all I had to say. We were talking about a roller coaster with respect to Romanian investments, and I would like to ask Mr. Matjaz, what is education? What is the importance of the financial education in the development of this investment area? Can a more educated people in this financial area could have like more stability and could eliminate this roller coaster situation?
So education in finance generally,
educația în privința financiară în general este esențială și sunt surprins că în Europa, nu doar în România, în Europa, de exemplu, eu locuiesc în Austria de 15 ani, educația financiară în Austria este la fel sau poate chiar mai puțin decât ce am văzut în România. La același lucru se întâmplă și în Germania. În toată Europa, în afară de Regatul Unit, situația este mult mai rea decât în România în privința educației financiare. Și această problemă devine acută pentru că, istoric, oamenii au putut să-și asigure pensiile
predominantly in fixed income products. But because of the recent 10 years of historically low interest rates, the yields on the fixed income are not sufficient to cover the pensions for the people. So in that sense, people without financial or with not sufficient financial education are not able to estimate and assess these risks coming from this environment appropriately, and therefore cannot change their portfolios correctly. So in that sense, financial education is key. And then what is happening because of these ultra low interest rates across US, for example, and the UK, we are seeing that the shift, which has been typically 60% of your portfolio in fixed income and 40% in equity, is shifting into alternative investments. So recently, the CIOs of some of the biggest asset managers globally came up with a allocation of 40-40-20 or 40-30-30, in a sense that they have lowered the allocation to fixed income and basically put into the global allocation of their portfolios 20 to 30% of alternative investments. So in that sense, people need to be educated to understand the need for these moves. So that's one thing. The other thing is what we are also seeing across Europe is that when you talk to young generation, which are in their high schools or maybe even at universities, and talk about the role models, mostly across Europe, or particularly across the Central Eastern Europe, you would hear that their role models are, sportsmen. But for example, once you see somebody like the founder of UiPath landing such a spectacular success, I hope that this kind of success will trigger the young generation to say, when you ask them what is their aspiration, to say entrepreneur or an investor, because this is what is needed to start making the financial education popular, because only this financially educated people will be able to secure their pensions long term, given the financial environment we are in. So in that sense, by all means, education is key, and I think this education, I'm astonished that even not in the elementary schools and secondary schools, financial education is not part of the curriculum, and that people, are not educated about the financial education the same way as they're about traffic, because in reality, Probably financial education is as important for an individual as knowing what the different traffic signs mean on the road and how the traffic is regulated. So in that sense, you know, I hope that Europe is recognizing this and will be pushing this, because this is the only way to basically have people enough of the understanding of financial markets to make sound investment decisions, which, as I say, are currently, we are seeing this globally, significantly increasing exposure to alternative investments.
Mulțumesc, doamna Bobircă. Există bariere legislative, practic. Asta este unul dintre subiectele pe care le putem dezvolta în toate domeniile, indiferent că vorbim de investiții, de infrastructură și așa mai departe.
The topic investments, infrastructure. So we're talking about legislative barriers. So there is a will, but there is a will, but most of the times there are these barriers which hinder the development of this investitional industry. I would like to have like a loop before answering your question related to the legislative barriers which do exist in any type of jurisdiction, but Romania has a certain specificity which is determined by structural barriers, which to a certain extent explain what Mr. Cîrciumaru was saying earlier. This excitement with respect to the venture investments. There is a high finance deficit with respect to the small and medium-sized enterprises. There are also estimates around 4.8% of the gross domestic product. So together, the two asset classes, as they appear in the investitional statistics, this type of imbalance between the financing offer and the financing need supports public policy measures. I mean, public support programs in order to facilitate the access to Romanian financing. We already know, and you've talked during the previous panels about the imbalance of funds, the low level of companies. So therefore, this need for intervention is related more to equity. So this is financing through equity. How can we solve this barrier, the structural barrier, or what are the intervention types? So we can solve this through public funds. And if we look at the structure of investors for Central and East European funds in such private equity funds, we see that the governmental agency are the greatest investors, are the majority investors. So this is specific to the Central and Eastern European market, and we can see this on the Romanian market as well. What shall this bring about? Probably this is already a public information. Approximately 400,000 million euro are allocated from the National Program for Recovery, is directed to the setup of some funds for recovery. And all these stages mentioned before had from earlier stage to private equity. So we expect, therefore, to launch at the beginning of next year to have some interest displayed by the managers of these schemes, who is European Investment Funds, and we shall select approximately 20 teams. This is our intention, 20 management teams for these new emerging funds on the market. Mr. Cîrciumaru said that these funds already exist, and we know that they were financed from European sources, such as Capmind, Morphosis, Black Sea Capital, and even from Jeremy funds, who have a great performance and who already represent an opportunity for all market participants. So we shall have this financing offer on the market, which shall entail creating management teams, and at the same time will entail a discussion about the investment targets of these funds in Romanian companies. Maybe it is good to mention that these funds are not necessarily national, can be regional funds. And I believe we can open a discussion starting from this point. We can open a discussion related to the various categories of barriers, although as seen in previous panels, as mentioned before, there are initiatives which try to raise awareness within the current legislative environment. So they try to find a way to facilitate these provisions. So we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Let's hope that in the end, hope is all we have. I will have to add some things as well, because there are some things to be said related to the existence of some legislative barriers, which are important to analyze, especially through the perspective of these recent initiatives, which are, of course, positive. One has turned into reality, of course, but
the framework of Law 243 needs to be more flexible, because right now it places a lot of restrictions. If we talk about the industrial development, well, there are two different things here. If we talk about growing investments and the shares of these investments in Romania's economy, that's one thing. But if we talk about increasing the number of funds registered as alternative investment funds in Romania, that's an entirely different issue. I would like to tell you that a comprehensive development of Romania as a target for the private equities, well, this is not a condition. There are many examples. There are economies that are much more developed than Romania's in France, Italy, Spain, where the private equities operating there are not registered in those jurisdictions. Also, there are other situations with very good jurisdictions, quite permissive, such as the Netherlands and Luxembourg, and these countries are not countries of destination for the monies inside these funds. So we need to be very careful with what we want. We have to refrain from being too ambitious. We don't need risk capital into our economy too much. Well, these funds have become from outside the country so far, and a lot of time will pass before these capital sources become national sources. But we also need to see some changes in the pension legislations. These changes are more than welcome, but their impact will be seen in the long term. So, we need to understand what the conditions are based on which these long-term foreign capitals would accept to come in Romania. And there are two obstacles here. One is associated to the legal and tax framework, and another one, equally important, is associated to how investors perceive the stability of this legal framework. If we talk about creating a jurisdiction for the registration of some funds, I'd like to say that the existing legal framework should be amended. More specifically, it should permit for the existence of limited liability partnerships. Well, it is known that the classical functioning structures for the private equities are these partnerships and the general partner, limited partner relationship. They are fiscally transparent, they can operate with different classes of shares and so on. These changes involve an amendment of law, of company law number 31, which is very difficult to amend. On the other hand, the existence of law 243, and I will be a little bit abrasive, but it's important to say that, well, that is a major negative for the time being, because it makes a difference between the Romanian jurisdiction on one side and, for instance, the Dutch jurisdiction on the other hand. The harmonized norms do not impose for a regulation of the investment funds, but just regulations concerning the fund managers. So, whatever we have in Law 243 is not to be found in the jurisdiction preferred by foreign investors such as Luxembourg or the Netherlands. The extremely detailed and restrictive provisions and the onerous conditions, I'm talking here about the taxes and fees associated to an alternative investment fund that govern the way in which these funds work in Romania, are a major deterrent. And we, in our Association of Private Equity, consider that Romania may be comparable to the Netherlands and Luxembourg only if Law 243 is amended, but also if some other regulations change as well. Let me give you an example. So, as far as we are concerned, although not enough, when it comes to the regulation of the alternative investment funds, well, these should be handled by professional investors. And maybe individual investors investing more than 100 investors should be qualified as professional investors. This would be a major step forward, but we will propose that in the future by approaching the management of the Financial Supervisory Authority. And we should also say that even if we manage to do that, we need to realize that Romania's image in front of the investors is not too stable and credible. I don't want to say the countless changes in the fiscal code, and this stability and this predictability are key elements to the long-term decisions, such as the private equity investment or alternative funds. And for a lot of time from now on, the investments should come from another jurisdictions that have that enjoy a positive image. And I don't think that legislation should be that restrictive in Romania. The Romanian legislation should not impose to fund investors to be organized in Romania, not necessarily. They should be able to organize themselves in other jurisdictions, because in our opinion, hybrid structures with funds in a country and managers in a different country won't work. So I guess we should be following the legislation that are applicable in Luxembourg or the Netherlands. I would like to red flag this. If good decisions are not calibrated, they can generate negative consequences. I apologize for my pretty long and technical speech, but I guess these clarifications were necessary. Well, thank you, Mr. Manda. Hopefully the representatives of the FSA have heard you, so that in the next meetings they can come up with some good news. We would like to welcome Mr. Paul Prodan, President of the Oversight Commission of SIF Transilvania. Before asking him something, I would like to remind you and ask you kindly to step in, just like Mr. Manda did, and please ask questions. And I'm telling this to Mr. Prodan, who joined us a little bit later and may have not heard this requirement of mine. And I would like to ask the people who are watching us on Zoom or on the Facebook page. A lot of people are looking at us, and I believe that they have 1 million questions, but I see myself during my student years. I remember this, so I remember how shy I was. So please don't be shy as a student at the desk. Please ask questions so that at the end of the day we can clarify all of our questions. Mr. Prodan, I would like to ask you something. Well, I would like to ask you this. These funds, these private equity funds and the alternative investment funds from Romania, so could they support companies so that they become unicorns? And this happens in circumstances just like Mr. Matjaz said, companies turning out a very good result at world level, like, well, of course I can say this is the purpose of the alternative investment fund. Well, actually I forgot to say hello, and I apologize for being late. Well, for the time being, the fund that I represent is in between private equity and investment, alternative investment funds. But by background, I am a private equity. I am managing 92 companies with all sorts of participations and interests. My equity used to be a private equity fund, but it was not used as such. This is our purpose, to boost again, to bring some new challenge into the Romanian market. And our purpose is to provide funds wherever necessary. And why not to create unicorns? But we need to change the risk perception for that purpose. And how do we change the risk perception? Well, this is the largest challenge. As long as the media, the economic media, when an action, for instance, well, a share goes by 2%, and the headline in a newspaper is that, you know, the funds of the retirees are diminishing by 2%, we are not going to do much. So if we advertise any millimeter of change, nothing will happen. But if we judge things in the long run, if we consider the scalable evolutions, then we will change people's risk perception. This is what we want to do with the SIF3. We want to redefine the small, average, and large risks. We want to become venture capitals per se, with small companies that are nothing today, but do have an impact, and they run the risk of losing the money, the scarce money that they have. And these companies can actually become small unicorns, not unicorns as UiPath. And these are our purposes. And if others will think as we do, Romania's economy will set itself on a path to growth and success. Well, the financing deficit is an opportunity. Our opportunity is to provide funds to the non-bankable entities. Of course, that those companies should accept a certain amount of transparency, of an intrusion into their corporate lives. So, there's a trade-off, and we need to overcome the perception that I don't want people to know what is going on within my company. These are customary things that have been putting the brakes on Romania's economy. And Mr. Manda was saying something that I agree, the legislation. We would like to see laws as the Luxembourg has and the Netherlands has, but maybe 100 years separates us from these countries. So we are still making a confusion between funds and fund managers. These are two different entities that do different things. So this is on a fast forward style, whatever differentiates. When do we have the first hedge fund in Romania? When are you going to see it in this country? Yes, who is brave enough to create the first hedge fund in Romania? I would like to step in, Mrs. Boburca says. I would like to pick up Mr. Prodan's and Mr. Manda's ideas. I actually agree to them. Well, after giving it a great deal of thought and after trying to understand the obstacles getting in the way of Romania's markets and economy, well, in broad terms, we are still going round to this idea of needing financing by means of equity. Regardless of this, the equity finance will generate other effects on the capital markets and other investment funds which you mentioned in the beginning, not only for the alternative funds. So that is why the equity financing is so badly needed. We still don't have it as we would like to have it. When it comes to the regulatory obstacles, well, I actually entered a loop into my answer in order to enable Mr. Manda to pick it up at some point, because he has a lot of things to say. Well, I'd like to add this. Well, simple rules are valuable because they are reconfirmed in time. And one of the rules is follow the money. We've heard a lot about that. So we need to look at the interest of the investors, and we need to look at the investors' sentiment. We are trying to label it like a risk perception or otherwise, but this is actually about the sentiment. And there are jurisdictions, for instance, the one in Luxembourg, that are validated by institutional investors, such as the EIB, the EIF. We know about that market that it has a AAA rating, and we are getting back to Mr. Prodan with the time that we have our disposal to get to that sort of rating and to correct the risk perception when it comes to our own market. We are also seeing by looking around and by looking at the entire East European market that most of the investments done in the investment private equity funds in Central and Eastern Europe are coming also from the Central and Eastern Europe. So investors actually are public, but those who understand this geography and the features of these markets, and those who do understand the risk and the reputation of these jurisdictions, are the public investors. And probably we need to add something about the way in which we develop the Romanian market. We need to talk about the support services that are necessary to these investment funds. We talk about the investors, we talk about the management teams, we talked about the administrators, we talk about the funds per se, but there is something else, an ecosystem, a network of support services that are quite well developed in the specialized jurisdictions, in the areas where these funds and their managers reside. So these services need to be there in order to support this industry. These services need to be of good quality, and they should be sized properly so that they can serve this industry. And I would like to say one more thing, that in general, the regulations, if we look at Europe, refer to management, so to how these funds are being managed. The regulations also refer to the marketing, but there are no laws or not enough laws about the products. Well, there is not a consensus in this respect. The market is being set free so that the market can find for itself the optimum functional manner in order to encourage its own development. Well, we do have this regulation for the alternative investment funds in our country, and basically this regulation is now being amended. I would like to say, on an optimistical note, that there's a lot of that there is a long way to go ahead of us. We still need to build a lot. So, like they did in the Netherlands and in Luxembourg, the market needs to cooperate with the state, and they need to have a permanent dialogue if we want to build something and if we want to build a road into the future. So the regulator and the market and the professional associations and the industry associations, they all need to be working together in order to build something. If you allow me, Mr. Manda says, I would like to step in because I would like to add something to Anna's words. Well, indeed, about Romania's chances to produce unicorns and about the ingredients that are necessary to get there. Well, About Romania's unicorns, we need to say that they are still there. We are unable to see them because they are not been made visible by the IPOs and by others, but there have been other companies that have been funded when they were younger by private equity funds, by venture capitalists, and right now they are past the 1 billion obstacle. I've invested myself in Bitdefender. This is becoming a better known name. But what I would like to tell you, starting from these findings that we have about the acute lack of capital, we've heard some figures here. Well, indeed, in the year 2020, the private equity investment in Romania's GDP was of 0.034%. In Europe, it's 12 times higher, and the average in Central Europe is 3 times higher, is 0.1% of the GDP. So the gap is very large, and hence we need to work a lot more. Well, I would also like to put a red flag on a different thing. I've seen an accelerated growth of the industry in terms of venture capital. There is a certain amount of effervescence of the investors. There's a certain amount of enthusiasm, even in the authorities. They think of support options for the risk capital investments. And I'm thinking of this venture capital that seems to be, quite heroic, from zero to hero idea. This is something that is a catalyst and something that supports a lot of aspirations and so on and so forth. But if we were to look at the way in which a company develops and has the chance to become a unicorn, we need to understand that an intervention by the state, by accelerators and so forth, is not enough. We need to develop an ecosystem living all along the life cycle of the company. So the ecosystem should appear as early on as the unicorn appears, then capital injections, and then it goes further into the future of the company as the company becomes national or international. And our situation is not good at all in Romania's ecosystem. Well, if we were to think of the monies that are available right now on the market when it comes to capital development, well, the status is pretty different from the venture side of things. And actually, Anna mentioned the intention of the government to include funds in the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. So, it's good to have that in Romania as well. And there are some entities and people with a long-standing experience, and they will get involved, and this is good. Well, I don't think that the market will be able to provide solutions in the pre-IPO phases, because in that particular phase, the amounts are huge, dozens of millions, hundreds of millions, and I don't think that there's somebody in Romania capable of investing that amount of cash at that early stage. But it's important to see this ecosystem going, and it's important to see that the unicorn is being supported all through their lifetime. Also, our industry needs to be professionalized, because if you want to originate and if you want to discover these companies as early on as possible, companies that have a chance to become technology leaders or that could generate some business models and or technologies, a lot of education is needed. Expertise and education are needed. And it is also very much important that the industry should develop through education and by becoming more open and by understanding technologies, because these are the things that make a difference. Because otherwise, although we may have money, and we see now companies leaving Romania, so companies are leaving Romania to some accelerator in London or Berlin or US, you know, and at that particular time, the relationship with the original market is, you know, broken. I know of such things. I know of companies that have been extremely successful, but they left the country and they started being funded from other investors from other markets. Anyway, on a happy side, on a happy note, there are things remaining in Romania. Romania still has a big benefit when it comes to software and IT. We have these industries that are very well populated by very well educated. They are using very efficiently their own resources, but you know, we are kind of losing that competitive benefit, and I guess that we do need more capitalization on this comparative benefit, and I will rest my case here. Thank you.
We've discussed.
This is Matjaz Schroll speaking. Maybe just a couple of comments here.
Aș dori să fac câteva comentarii. Cred că toată această dezbatere legată de legislația.
But you know, I think Romania can just look up to the other countries that went through the same kind of development. And for example, if you look today at Estonia, Estonia has the highest number of unicorns per capita in Europe. So 1.3 million inhabitants country has 7 unicorns. How did Estonia achieve that? They made private equity investing as easy and venture capital investing as easy as possible. And today they are becoming the leading technology nation in Europe with the highest number of unicorns per capita in Europe. You look, for example, into Poland. Poland had initially their pension funds that were the ones that built up the local capital market. And on that basis, they built up the biggest private equity companies investing throughout the Central Eastern Europe. For example, you look at Croatia. Croatia was where Romania is 4 years ago. They opened up the pension funds to invest into alternative funds in 2017. And within 3 years, they had a 10% limit of how much of total assets they can invest in alternative assets. Today, most of Croatian pension funds have maxed out their investments to alternative investment funds and private equity. And today, they are asking the regulators, and they are going to approve and increase this threshold from 10% probably to 15 or 20%. So in that sense, Romania opened up the market, the alternative fund investments to pension funds last year, and there is a 10% limit. So what I hope that Romania will be just following these other markets, because it goes through the same life cycle than these other markets go. And the only advice I have is for the local pension funds to be the pioneers, as they were in all of these markets, the pioneers, who will develop the local alternative investment scene and private equity scene. And on that basis, the regulation will need to evolve, because as I said initially, US institutional investors are already having 30% of their total asset allocation to alternative investments, whereas Romania is still at a very, very low numbers, but at least there is a law in place. So in that sense, my message here is Romania is making progress, even though if you look into this from within Romania, I guess, you know, the progress is never fast enough. But when we look from outside, we see progress, and we are seeing Romania going through the same stage of development as what we've seen Estonia, we've seen Poland, Croatia, and other countries in Central Eastern Europe. That's it from my end.
Mulțumesc. Domnul Cîrciumaru, iată, avem țări cumva din jurul nostru. Vorbim de Croația, vorbim de Polonia, de Estonia. Ce lipsește României ca să intre, să fie în topurile astea?
Bună întrebare. Legat de ce a spus Matjaz mai devreme, aici eu nu m-aș grăbi să afirm că Estonia sau orice altă țară care a dezvoltat un număr mai mare, semnificativ mai mare de unicorni raportat la PIB sau la populație sau la ce vreți alt indicator economic, a făcut acest lucru datorită unui mai bun cadru legislativ sau unui mai bun înlesnirea direcționării capitalului către companii. Părerea mea este, sau mă rog, probabil că, adică cu siguranță și acest lucru a ajutat. Eu mi-aș îndrepta poate un pic mai mult atenția către ce a spus mai devreme domnul Prodan, și anume percepția, o schimbare un pic de paradigmă în ceea ce privește percepția riscului. Pentru că, într-adevăr, sunt foarte mulți bani, sunt foarte mulți investitori care gestionează sume enorme de bani și când zic asta mă gândesc în primul rând la fondurile de pensii. Iar modul cum, în general, acești investitori instituționali foarte mari percep riscul, folosind clasicele modele financiare din piețe, dacă vom continua să ne uităm la risc în felul acesta, nu vom investi niciodată în venture capital. Adică, dacă vom continua să privim riscul prin măsuri de volatilitate, de beta, de ce a mai zis Markowitz sau Sharp, probabil că venture capital nu o să intre absolut niciodată pe radarul unor astfel de investitori. Fie că sunt fonduri de pensii sau când alt gen de fonduri de investiții. Părerea mea și modul cum... Sunt două direcții, două puncte de vedere pe care le-aș menționa. Unul este cum vede sau cum mă uit eu personal, că sigur și aici sunt moduri diferite de a privi lucrurile, la o investiție de tip
see a venture capital investment through the risks. This is one thing, and I will present more details on this. And the second is related to this virtuous circle which has been created, and which is the one which shall create speed for the industry and which shall accelerate the development of the industry, together with the success of UiPath, and we have other successful startups as well. On the one hand, this brings capital into the industry, and on the other hand, we are talking about the trust we place in a company. And in this respect, we need two components: competence and the type of the teams that perform the investment. And this is related to the perception of risk any investor has when it performs an investment. So we place our capital to some companies. Those companies take the capital and then they use a business model, and then we expect some results. We expect a yield. This yield, by reference to the risk we undertake, is lower or higher depending on some components. It is the financial education part, trust in the team, the skills of the team are important, and they are strengthened, they are improved as other successful companies emerge. And we were talking about education and allocation of capital, at least for this venture area, has been the highway through which a lot of education has been brought into the industry, because the investors who have placed their money in this industry, in this asset class, have also offered a lot of experience which was poured, let's say, into the industry, and which was quite helpful. And I've seen this a lot during the last 4 or 5 years. So I've seen this in companies which attract capital, and the quality of financial education and the way the investors approach the situation has been highly improved. And this is what is feeding this virtuous cycle. So I go back to the elements which influence the yield and risk ratio. So some of them are related to the potential of increasing the yield. I'm talking about the disruption of the business model, to the size of the market. So there are elements which apply to the risk level of the investment. Also, the trust we place in the team and the competence of the team are important, the competition is important, and so on. Somehow, from my point of view, the thing that will accelerate the improvement or the increase of the allocation level to these asset classes is the way we perceive risk. And if we manage to move further away from the classic models with respect to the measurement of a historical volatility, I think we will be more capable of bringing more capital to these areas which are considered risky areas. If we allocate capital only according to some historical measurements of volatility, no one will invest in venture capital. So if we eliminate the survival and bias, and if we analyze the funds which lost money for investors, historically speaking, this asset class has a very low yield. And this very low yield, some of them even call it zero yield for a period of 30 years. But this very low yield, if it is compared to the humongous volatility of this industry, from company who lose their money up to company who have thousands of millions. So we don't have like financial models. So, and nevertheless, there are thousands of billions which are placed in this asset class. And this is related to the perception of risk. And again, I'm talking about this class by eliminating the survival and bias. Romania is at the beginning in this respect, but if we analyze things globally, they are quite present. You are right, Mr. Cîrciumaru. My name is Paul. Unfortunately, the risk perception, the risk culture, I might be too rough, but this risk culture is elementary. We are still talking about, with respect to risk, we are still talking about the 2008 crisis. In 2008, if you remember, the real estate crisis has hindered the pension funds a lot. So the pension funds are not related to the real estate per se, but is related to the yield. So if the Wirecard story was an internal fraud at a high level, of course, but it is still related, is still presented with respect to risk, of course this kind of kills any new attempt of considering risk from another perspective. And that is why we have this vicious circle of the risk culture. The vast majority, when we wanted to do something, the first answer was no. It wasn't let's build something, it was simply no, we cannot do it. And I have another example. I have been working a lot in the security markets. And we had yields of 100% up to negative yields, down to negative yields. for each risk stage, we used to say we don't know how to invest, there's nowhere to invest. So we didn't know how to do anything else. So we had a step, we had a step back, and when we saw that others recovered, so we go back to the financial education idea. It is not at the level required nowadays. We must start from the 6th grade with financial education. So these are my observations. Mr. Manda talked about the state's intervention, and at the level of the regulation and at the level of capital allocation, because this PNRR fund this fund for resilience and recovery, so all this is important, but I am happy that their decision to manage is still in the hands of some professional managers. I'm a more pessimistic person with respect to the intervention of the state, and if you ask me, my expectations from the state are that the state should be as passive as possible, and it should let the ecosystem develop itself. Of course, the state can help in a huge way, and the allocation of funds can help, but the way it does this is very important. So if I were to analyze the venture capital and the Startup Nation program, which was present some years ago, and if somebody were to tell me how much money was poured into that program, I don't know if the results measure up to the money put into that program. I'm referring to a state intervention mechanism with respect to the venture capital. So that's the one. That's not Startup Nation, actually. We have other examples as well. We should not reinvent the wheel. We should see what the state is doing in Israel. So it all started from the need to defend themselves. And the support they have with respect to infrastructure. Cybersecurity is taught as of the 5th grade. So this is the way they try to solve the issues they are facing. So this whole ecosystem they have created related to technology, and there are many companies which stem from there, but all this is related to a comprehensive thinking, not just in the phase of facilitating the access to capital, but we are also talking about education, infrastructure, and it all depends on the real problem of the state. The intervention is justified in case of market failures, this financing cap, not in any situation. It all starts from the need. Why do I need to invest? And if we started with the 5th, 6th grade, this would be a cultural revolution in Romania, and if we started financial education there. But other countries manage to do it. In the 5th grade, we are still teaching multiplications. We must understand that public administration means online environment for 5 or 6 years. So we have this lack of fiction, because this means a more efficient way of operating the economy. It is a wider framework. But in the case of software and technology in Estonia, but the country operates online, and it all started from the need of the online environment for the state. So we reach the classical paradigm that the greatest contractor of goods and services is the state everywhere. If the state doesn't have a concrete, measurable demand, the offer cannot exist. But when the state submits a proper demand, we will have a proper offer. So, in order to answer your question, in order to have unicorns, we lack courage. We don't have courage. We are afraid. If an investor comes on the market and asks 10% for a small enterprise, this means the lack of confidence. 10% if the yields are negatives, 10% if the opportunity cost is negative. What shall we do in this case? So it all starts from the courage. Thank you. There is courage on a market where predictability will be something common. Although we have regulations, the laws keep changing. We were talking about the modification of the tax law, and in this case, the courage starts to fade. But that doesn't mean there are no perspectives for development. I've always said when I see small numbers, this means that there are perspectives for increasing those numbers and perspectives for developing the market with or without courage. I would like to ask if there is a linguistic barrier, a delay of translation. That's why he is a little quiet today. I would like to ask him, what does he analyze in case of private equity or alternative investment funds when he's looking for a company that he wants to develop or a company he wants to invest in? So this is a question for Mr. Matjaz. So we are talking about regulation. Let's see how things are from the perspective of the investor. So what do I analyze when I want to invest?
Okay, so let me answer you with an example. So Templeton Private Equity, we were the first global private equity investing in InPost in 2015. That's a Polish company that made an IPO on Amsterdam Stock Exchange end of January this year with a valuation of roughly 8.5 billion euros, so roughly $10 billion. So at the time when we invested in InPost in 2015, this was a rather small company, but the owner, who was also the CEO of the company, had big plans, incredible energy, and was having a strong track record up until then. And that was the key. So basically, there were two reasons why we invested in InPost. One was the underlying industry, because we knew that e-commerce can only be profitable as long as the last mile delivery cost is optimized, and this is what InPost is focusing on. So that means we were investing in a structurally growing industry, and we found a founder and CEO of the company who has been extremely ambitious and who has had a strong track record in making things happen. So InPost went through a very difficult part between 2015 and 2017, but eventually turned out to be one of the most successful last mile delivery company in the world, and one of the best, and actually the best private equity transaction we've ever done in a Templeton in Central and Eastern Europe and in global emerging market. So in that sense, if you ask me what we are looking for, it's two things. One is a structurally growing industry and the business model, and the second one is the management team and the founder. As long as these two things are fine, then we will for sure do a detailed due diligence and then decide to invest. But these are the two fundamental things. So in that respect, coming back to Romania, I think you all underestimate the attractiveness of Romania as a private equity and venture capital destination, because you all who live in Romania are too focused on legislative, macroeconomic, and other issues that you see in the country. But I tell you, the perspective from outside shows Romania as, I think, one of the two most attractive private equity markets in Central Eastern Europe. And the reason for that is that Romania has a very well-educated natural sciences, very well-educated workforce with a very strong IT background. And this is the key, because in the current world, you can always get money, you can always change laws, but what is the most difficult thing to get is very well-educated people who have a strong natural science and technology background, and this is what is the key asset of Romania. So in that sense, I'm very optimistic about the Romanian PE and venture capital future, unless, of course, the country will act destructive and will basically scare away the money. But I can assure you that when we are doing the analysis of Central Eastern European countries, Romania is at the very top in terms of the future perspectives, in terms of venture capital and private equity. So that's it from my end.
Domnule Schroll, vă mulțumesc. Vă mulțumesc pentru că ați venit cu două vești bune astăzi.
Thank you for bringing us two pieces of good news today. On the one hand, you are telling us that the level of financial education of Romanians is not as low as we see it from the inside. Myself, as a journalist, I have the feeling that we are somewhere really at the bottom. And on the other hand, from the perspective of the one who is looking at Romania beyond its borders, you are telling us that we are a country with a high potential, and the capitalization on this potential is within reach. And all this extraordinary for myself, because due to the wars or political and economical wars that we see every day, I have the feeling that we have like a barrier in front of our eyes, and we no longer are able to see the advantages we have in this country. So I would like to have a round table, because I have this feeling of optimism with respect to what Mr. Schroll said, and I would like to ask each of you, what is your opinion on this investment area in the near future? So by looking at the big picture, including regulation, what's happening in the political area, the money which enters this area, what is your perspective from this point of view in Romania? Thank you. I want to say that we feel the excitement in this venture capital industry, and I want to reconfirm this. It is recomforting what Matjaz has said, and I would like to thank you. I am in complete agreement with his assessment. There is potential, and this type of potential is analyzed by the private equity funds. The potential to transform a business into a great company. There is enough money, as we can see, and as we have said, and there will be more money. There are professionals. I think that the regulation will be in alignment as well. The idea of courage must be supported, because as a conclusion, as you said during the discussion, that these successful stories are helpful for us. Matjaz started by mentioning UI Path. Everybody is talking about successful stories. We can capitalize on these good examples. We have EMAG, Big Defender. All these companies help us so that we can prove, we can validate on the international market something that we know, but it is more difficult to convey this message, since we don't have too many such examples, and such examples are easy to understand by those who are not professional investors. So my perspective is optimistic, and the potential must be reached. Mr. Manda, I subscribe to this position as well. I think we will keep seeing an increase of the industry with respect to the amounts invested. I'm convinced that we shall see within the next 12 months we shall see a few more successful examples. I don't want to give names, but this is my opinion, and these names shall contribute to the increasing interest in the Romanian market. The private equity will have more amounts coming from the European Union, which will be substantial and which will lead to the increase of goods and services in Romania and will allow Romanian companies to develop. All these elements shall lead to the development of the industries. What is not so positive is the situation of the education, which unfortunately, leaving aside the situation generated by the pandemic during the last 2 years, but there is a decline of the education, and unless something happens in order to stop this decline, the problem of the Romanian economy will be this middle income trap, which is faced by many other emerging markets. I hope that the decision makers will find a solution for the education on which Romania depends so much. We must change the business model, we must change innovation, and we have no money put in innovation and research, and this can have an impact on the economic development pace and including the economy. By and large, I think everything is positive overall. Mr. Cîrciumaru.
Foarte optimist sunt și eu în privința viitorului industriei de investiții.
Well, about the future of the investment industry, we should talk about the opportunities that exist on the market and that will be around. We need to talk about the availability of the capital, about the quality of the administrators. Well, we are taking baby steps in all of these respects. Matjaz was right when he talked about how these improvements are to be seen from the outside. I mean, the improvements on the Romanian market. So I am extremely optimistic in terms of the industry as a whole. We still need a number of catalysts that should reinforce the success of this industry just a little bit. We've talked a lot about the UiPath. We've talked about the many other companies, not of that size, but you know, these companies need to be more visible, and they need to be catalysts of the industry on the whole. And I also agree to what Mr. Manda said about education, because this is the foundation of the society. And if we don't have education, if we don't have better education, well, if the education is not improving and if the quality is not consistent with whatever is going on the market, then we should no longer talk about investment or about things like that. So these are my 2 cents, but you know, in broad lines, I am extremely optimistic about the investment done in Romania. Mr. Prodan. Well, Matjaz said something which was not news to me, but you know, we are people who are criticizing ourselves a lot. We don't see anything positive. Whatever Matjaz said, we've seen over the past 30 years. Well, foreigners have always seen the potential, and we haven't. So we don't have research, for instance. how many of us would put 100,000 euros in a potential research project? Well, healthcare is quite fashionable, but we don't have a risk culture good enough to push us into this sort of investment. As soon as we overcome this barrier, we'll become more positive. But since the National Recovery and Resilience Plan has been signed, things will be moving on. There are 35 billion for consulting and training. Well, this is money payable for Horeca, tourism, and other industries that have suffered. Well, this is going to generate investment opportunities and added value. This is going to be an engine to Romania, and I look forward to that money getting into the market. Well, thank you so much. Well, I started this conversation on a pessimistic note, also influenced by the weather, but now I'm more optimistic. I'd like to thank you all, dear gentlemen and dear lady, for changing my spirits and for changing for the better the spirits of everybody who's participated in this discussion. So I'm leaving this discussion with this idea, with this thought that we can do more. I mean, I was kind of feeling that, but you know, I see the news, and the news sometimes erode our wish to do things. Thank you so much for changing my mood. I would like to thank the organizers for, you know, enabling me to be here for the second year in a row in the presence of so many people who are so experienced in this particular line of work. I hope to see you again next year and in the years after. I hope to see you again because, you know, I shouldn't be saying this because we deal with business, but I kind of like you all. I love you all. And now we need to pass the microphone to Mr. Horia Manda. I would like a word of advice. Please try in your TV show to start with positive news. 30% of the news should be positive, and you should start with them. But if you start with the bad news, like, you know, the leu is going down by 2 units, this is a bad piece of news. And I'm also urge you something. Mr. Mihai Ionita actually said, that there is a long way ahead of us. We need to work a lot. Thank you, Mr. Horia Gusta. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Elian. Thank you, lady. Thank you, gentlemen. Well, I hope that we have managed to create a relevant and virtual space where we can connect and debate things that are extremely interesting. We promise to have the 4th summit at the end of September 2022. So thank you once again. I hope that the audience have received with great interest today's debate. I would also like to the sponsors, because if it hadn't been for them, we would not have been able to have this discussion, and you've heard them all.
OTP Asset Management, Fondul Proprietatea, SIF Banat Crișana, Evergent Investment, SIF Transilvania, SIF Muntenia și SIF Oltenia.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I promise you to be there again for you next year. Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.